there's so many ways to attack this, but we'll start with what you've heard. C.J. Stroud, we know that everybody was there. Josh McCown was joking with him. Hey, when you get to town, we'll play some basketball. And everyone freaked out and said, oh, it's got to be C.J. Stroud. Now, it seems to be the momentum is shifting more towards Bryce Young. He's coming to town tomorrow. So what's the latest, and what have you heard about which way this organization might be leaning with that number 1 overall pick?
Well, I'll tell you this. They moved up to number 1 to have their choice of C.J. Stroud or Bryce Young. They didn't move up to number 1 so they have a shot at Anthony Richardson. If they thought that he was the guy or Will Levis was the guy, they would have traded up to number 3. They wouldn't have wasted the extra draft picks and given up DJ Moore to get to where they had to get to number 1. They wanted control of that pick, and they knew it was going to be one of those 2 guys, Young or Stroud. So I think that initially people were kind of overreacting, saying, hey, the height thing and the size thing is going to be Stroud because all Frank Reich has ever coached are tall quarterbacks. Well, the game has changed. I've talked to a lot of people who said that Frank was willing to change with the game. And if you look at guys like, Patrick Mahomes, he's still 6'1", but he improvises. He makes plays a lot like Bryce Young does. So they're willing to take a look at that. It's not set in stone. I think it could either be the one of them still, but they're not really worried about the height factor right now. They're more worried about the durability with Bryce Young than they are the height. But I don't even think they're really that worried about that.
Interesting situation that they find themselves in. And I agree, Bryce Young, if you look at just the college tape, I think he's by far the best. I think C.J. Stroud is second. Of course, you mentioned they're not going in the direction of Anthony Richardson. I'll quickly say, just for context, David, I said I would have taken Richardson with this selection only because of how much I trust in Jim Caldwell. And having him in the building as a mentor for that young quarterback is going to be a great asset for whomever the Panthers select. In your opinion, what are the things that have separated Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud to them just purely on the field?
Well, the one thing that stood out to me, a couple of things, but initially when Panthers general manager Scott Fitter was describing all the quarterbacks, one thing he said about Bryce Young was he said he's chill. Nothing's too big for him. The way he said it just resonated with me. Like, he's not worried about that. I remember Scott Fitter, he was there with Russell Wilson in Seattle, so he's not worried about the short version of a quarterback. And then after the pro day, he said that off the charts was what he called his ability to process. And Nick Saban said the same thing, the ability to make things out of nothing, make plays out of nothing. And I think that's what they're looking for in the way the NFL is headed right now. Yeah, you can have a guy like Stroud who can sit back in the pocket and make plays, and he's proven he can do that, but he hasn't proven that he can do that outside the pocket nearly as well as Bryce Young has done. And I think those elements to me are really key in what they're looking for and why he's sort of separated himself.
We're talking with David Newton, who covers the Carolina Panthers for ESPN. David, Frank Reich, as you mentioned, new head coach. Scott Fitter has been there for a couple years as the GM, spent 2 decades with the Seattle Seahawks, was instrumental in helping create that Super Bowl winning team with Russell Wilson at the helm. And then you've got Mr. Tepper, David Tepper, the owner, who hasn't really had an opportunity to get that pride and joy, right? He didn't come in when it was the height of the Cam Newton run. So when it comes draft day, who's ultimately going to have the most say and who's on that card that the Carolina Panthers hand into the NFL?
Well, David Tepper has made it clear that Frank Wright and Scott Fitter are going to be the guys that make the choice. Will he have an influence? Yeah. A lot of people are going to have an influence on this. But we've already kind of learned what happened when David Tepper made the call. He hired Matt Rule. Look how that turned out. He's not going to put himself in that position again. He's going to let the guys with the football knowledge make that decision. Does he like Bryce Young? I think he does. I think he likes him a lot. I think thinks he'd be a great face of the organization. But ultimately, he's going to let it come down to what Frank Wright says and Scott Fitter. And I think it makes sense because his track record over the last 5 years, I hope he's learned something to convince him that other people need to be making those choices.
It's interesting. How long has Scott Fitter been the GM there in Carolina?
He's only been there a couple of years. He came in and he really, I feel like he was brought in to kind of help Matt Rule along, because initially everybody thought that Matt Rule was the guy that had ultimate say over everything. But as soon as Scott Fitterer got there a couple of years ago, you could see a change, and you could see him having a bigger voice with the organization, a trust from ownership to kind of run things. And I think that's why they stuck with him after they let Matt Rule go.
Because this was interesting. I was actually there for the Bill Walsh internship going into Matt's last season. So I was there that off season. Met Scott Fitterer, seems like a really good person, good dude. I don't know his experience as it pertains to being able to evaluate the quarterback position. When you look at Frank Reich, even though he's a former NFL quarterback, a big part of the reason he's not in Indianapolis is because they couldn't get the quarterback position fixed. You know, Scott Fitterer, since he's been in Carolina, they haven't been able to get the position fixed. Does that give you any cause for concern? Josh McCown, great person, excellent basketball player. Some kind of way he became an NFL quarterback coach without ever having to coach at any other level of substantial level. So do you have any concerns about maybe the fact that historically, at least up until this point, not saying they can't get this right, this group really has not been excellent at that part of the evaluation process?
I can't argue with a single point you've made. You're spot on with everything there. But I do think, and you mentioned Caldwell, I think the fact he brought him on, I trust Jim Caldwell in there, and the people they brought in on the staff. And McCown, I think, can be a good mentor. And you mentioned Anthony Richardson earlier and why he would be good with a Caldwell. The problem is if you bring in Anthony Richardson and take him at number one and things don't work right away, and they're probably not going to work right away because I think he's a couple of years at least from being NFL ready, then you may be fired and you won't have a chance to really do what you want to do with this organization. I think they feel that Bryce Young is a guy that is NFL ready, and Stroud as well, that can come in and put him behind, the line they built, the running backs they built, Miles Sanders, they just added a lot of key pieces so they can just plug that quarterback in and have success. But you're right. They haven't had a lot of success. They've taken some flyers on Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold. They've all failed. I mean, Cam Newton, they brought him back. That failed as well. So they don't have a good track record with this. That's why I think they can't afford to take a risk when they go to number one and take anybody other than Stroud or Bryce Young.
David Newton, real quick, they had to do what they had to do. Adding DJ Moore, I'm presuming was they weren't going to extend him when his contract comes up at the level that he desired, but they also now are very limited at the pass catching positions for whomever they selected one. Do they have any plans to upgrade that receiving core?
I'm actually going to disagree with you on this a little bit. I think that DJ Moore, as good as he was on the field, he never was spectacular. He never was a guy that did a lot of damage in the red zone. And he really wasn't a leader in the wide receiver room. And that's key because they've had a lot of young receivers come through there. And DJ was a guy that just sort of led by example. And they feel like, it was costly to move on for him, but they feel like they're bringing in a Thielen and bringing in Chark. That gives them some veteran experience and maybe not as explosive as DJ Moore, but gives them a guy that can bring the rest of those receivers along. And Terrace Marshall Jr., they feel still has the potential to live up to that quality that can make him at least a number two receiver out there. But yeah, they still got to have some upgrades there. I look for them to maybe, if there's the right guys there in the second or third round at a wide receiver, I think they'll go for a guy there to try to upgrade their tight end as well. But they brought in Hayden Hurst. They've upgraded that room a little bit too. But I think the basis of what they have in that wide receiver room overall, even without DJ Moore, is probably stronger just because of the leadership you got with Thielen and Chark.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.